Good morning, students. I'm very excited about our presentation in Assembly this morning to celebrate the 65-year anniversary of the integration of Oak Ridge schools that happened back in 1955. That was 2 years before the integration of Little Rock, Arkansas, and a full year before the integration at Clinton High School. Whenever you think about history and you talk about history, there's two types of histories. There's the history that is as it happened, and then there's the history that is as it was recorded. And I think today we're going to walk a little bit along those lines of history as it happened and history as it's recorded. We're going to learn today about the history of the integration process here in Oak Ridge, how it came to be, what it was like. And we're also going to have the opportunity to talk to some of those brave men and women, the Scarborough 85, who were involved in the integration of both Robertsville Junior High School and Oak Ridge High School. These brave men and women of the Scarborough 85 were much like you. They were teenagers at the time. They loved to talk about music, hang out with friends. They loved sports and talking about cars in the same kind of way that you guys do. And sometimes when we think about history, we think about history as being something that happened long ago to older people. But history is lived by the youth, and we're going to hear about that today. I am very excited for this program. I think this is a long time coming. One of the things about living in a community that is referred to as the secret city is sometimes we're too good at keeping our secrets. And I think that one of the things that we have to do now is we have to learn these stories and share these stories and promote the history of Oak Ridge, because we have true American heroes that are living here amongst us in our communities. And today you're going to get a chance to get to know a few of them. So with that said, let me please welcome up our starter presenter today, Mr. Ray Smith, who's the historian for the city of Oak Ridge. So please give a round of applause for Mr. Ray Smith.
Thank you so much, Martin. It is so good to be here and to speak with you this morning. Martin said I could take the mask off when I talk, and I appreciate that because it fogs up my glasses, and you all know those problems. But what I'm going to do with you this morning is to present to you a brief look at the history of integration in Oak Ridge. Now, we will not cover everything that took place, but I hope we can give you enough insight that you'll realize some of the difficulties that had to be overcome. And you're going to hear later on from Larry Gibson, who lived it, and he can share with you stories, and you can ask any of these up here, and they have stories, they have insights that I can't give you. But I'm going to start by giving you a brief history, and now we're quickly going to move through the first slide or two because I want to talk about the early history. Native peoples have been here for thousands of years. The Yuchi was the Indians who were here. The Cherokee were to the south of us, and I need to point that out because one of my good friends is descended, David Hackett, descended from the Yuchi tribe, and he always tells me, Ray, the Cherokee were not here. The Yuchi were here. So I'm passing that on to you. The valleys provided shelter and good hunting. Streams provided the water. The white settlers began to arrive in the late 1700s, and the Cherokee did treaty with them to give them the land, even though, as the Cherokee would tell you, you can't own land, but in their opinion. But anyway, they did treaty with the settlers. They claimed large portions of the river bottoms and the streams. In the 1800s up to the Civil War period, there were large plantations in this area using slave labor. The African burial ground near the East Tennessee Technology Park is good evidence of that. If you've not been there, you really should go by and see that. There are over 100 graves there, only one large marker for the entire cemetery. And then there's also a small cemetery near the Gallagher family cemetery plot, just very close to that area, where the house slaves were buried. Now, by 1942, there were 1,000 farms, 3,000 people living in this area. It was fairly isolated, and just a few general merchandise stores in the area. The small communities like Robertsville, Wheat, New Bethel, New Hope, Scarborough, and you'll hear Elza included, but it was not a community. It was actually just a railroad stop. that was constructed when they were building the railroad tunnel that actually goes beneath Black Oak Ridge. If you've not gone and found that tunnel, of all of the hiking trails in Oak Ridge, that will have over 100 miles. And you can enjoy getting out and enjoy that area. And that's one of the things you should look for, along with the silo that's out in Hall Ridge that was a part of the Manhattan Project. Anyway, I diverse a little bit from what I was trying to tell you. There was one small community of African Americans located near where Cedar Hill Park is located today. Woods Chapel is the name of that structure, or the church there. Now, most of you will not know that. It's not something that's been included in our history and often overlooked. I'm glad to tell you that's what the Woods Chapel Church looked like. I have two images. That's the front of it and the side of it. And then the thing that makes it so intriguing is there's one tombstone at that cemetery up there, and it's the tombstone of Elijah Woods. He was a Civil War veteran of the Union-colored heavy artillery. His tombstone is the single one in the cemetery, and again, it's at the top of Michigan Avenue and Outer Drive. There are several field stones and approximately 20 graves that are located there for that cemetery. Now, on the tombstone, you can't see it very well, but the writing on there says Company K, USCHA. And what that stands for is Company K, United States Colored Heavy Artillery. Now, the Clinton Engineer Works came in here in 1942. African Americans were a part of that workforce during the Manhattan Project, but they were not treated the same as the white people. They were not allowed to bring their children, and the husbands and wives could not live together. They had to be in separate hutments. The hutments is just a 16-foot by 16-foot plywood structure with wooden flaps for windows. The K25 History Center, which is closed right now because of this pandemic, but opened the last week in February and will be reopening very soon, I hope. It has a replica of those hutments. There was just a stove in the middle and 4 beds around the 4 walls. And that was the extent of the accommodations for the people living in those hutments. Now, I said they separated husbands and wives. One lady figured a way to get to spend more time. They would let them actually come together for a short period of time. And she figured a way to get to spend more time with her husband. Katie Strickland asked one of the workers to bring her a piece of metal, just a pan. She wanted to make a pan to make biscuits on. So she got a piece of metal from the construction site at K25. She would lean it up against that stove in the middle of her hutment, and she would make biscuits. Then when she went to visit her husband, or when he came to visit her, whichever way it was going, she would give biscuits to the guard guarding that area for the women, and that way he would let her stay longer because of those good biscuits that he was getting. Now, another story I'll tell you about is Ernest Wilkins. He entered the University of Chicago at age 13, the youngest student ever admitted there. But the interesting thing about Ernest, he went on to get a PhD. The problem was Oak Ridge was just like all of the other South, living under the Jim Crow laws, and we'll talk about those a bit in a minute, that enforced racial segregation. They came from the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction area, and the idea was to promote white supremacy and black subjugation, to keep them as a way of life. And it says in the South, and that's what you'll hear, is that those Jim Crow laws were applied in the South. If you read into that and study it enough, you'll learn that they also started in the North. But the preponderance of the effects of the law took place in the South. And it was to keep the blacks under control, if you will, to segregate and to keep them from being integrated into the white society. Very bad time in our history. Now, if he had come to the South and had a scientific post here, he would not have been allowed to eat or to chat with the white men he was supervising in the whites-only cafeterias and recreation hall. If he rode a bus anywhere in Oak Ridge, he would have been forced to ride in the back. Now, this is taken from a historically speaking column that Carolyn Krause wrote for me in doing that research on Ernest Wilkins. So changes began to take place over time. Immediately after World War II ended with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, Gamble Valley was designated as a family housing area for African Americans. Children were allowed and families could live in houses. Scarborough School later on moved to Gamble Valley, brought the name with them. It's now known as the Scarborough Community. That's how that community got its name, is by that school being moved there. And then in 1954, the landmark decision of Brown versus the Board of Education began a process of integration. The Atomic Energy Commission integrated the Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High in 1955, and that's why we're celebrating this 65th anniversary of that significant event. I want to tell you about Waldo Kahn. Waldo was the chairman of the city council at the time. He wrote a letter to Congressman Howard Baker, Senator Baker's father, and said there was a tempest in a teapot in Oak Ridge because he had favored integration in the schools. Now, what actually happened is a small group of white people had a proclamation that they ran through the town and had enough signatures on it to have a recall election for Waldo Kahn because he had made this decision, promoted the idea of integration. They held the vote and it did not pass. It had to get a 2/3 majority to pass, and it didn't. So he did not have to resign from council. He did, however, resign from being the chairman because he was such a lightning rod and was causing the council so much difficulty. They did go ahead with the integration, and actually with only minor resistance, but when I say that, you have to understand that in the minds of the people who were brave enough to do it and who were in that situation, there were situations that were very difficult to deal with on a personal basis. And I won't go into those. Larry will tell you some about it. You can ask questions. I know we've got a question and answer session, and we'll get into some of that. It was not an easy thing to accomplish on a personal level. They know, the people who lived it actually know and understand. But the accomplishment of that integration is what's so very important. Now, in the 1960s, Reverend James Spicer, and I need to say that integration in 1955 was a good start, but it took until the 1960s to get other things integrated. The last thing to be integrated was a barber shop. But I want to tell you the story about the Davis Brothers cafeteria. It was a Jim Crow town. We talked about that earlier, and it was designed to maintain the segregation. It was a struggle even after the landmark desegregation of the 2 schools. Mayor at the time was Bob McNeese. He was a fiery individual. He could easily get turned on and get agitated. And he and James Spicer went to Atlanta to meet with the Davis brothers. Now, the meeting in Atlanta did not go well. Both Davis brothers were adamant they were not about to integrate their restaurant. So they escorted the mayor and the preacher out of their office. On the airplane ride back from Atlanta, again, the mayor was very frustrated, and he was just not having very good things to say about the Davis brothers. And then there was this well-dressed young man who overheard the conversation, and he asked the 2 of them, "Where are you from?" And they told him, "Oak Ridge." and went ahead to tell him all the deal about what they were trying to do, how they were trying to integrate those restaurants, and that the Davis brothers would not have any part of it. Well, a few days later, Gene Joyce, Oak Ridge lawyer, called the preacher and said, James Spicer, and said, you need to come to my office. His office was right across the street from Jackson Square, up there where Chapel on the Hill is. So he went down and was told that Davis Brothers not only had decided to integrate their restaurant in Oak Ridge, they had decided to integrate all their restaurants in the South. Now, the Davis Brothers were at the head of the Restaurant Association for the South at the time, so they had significant influence there. Now, what had happened is the young man, Guilford Glazier's son, went home and told his dad what was going on. Guilford called the Davis brothers and told them that he would give them free rent for their bowling alley. They had a restaurant that was doing real good, but they had a bowling alley that was not making money. And they had 6 more years to go at $8,000 a year rent in their contract. And Guilford Glazier forgave them that rent and told them that if they'd integrate their restaurant, he would make it worth their while to the tune of $48,000. So that's how the restaurants got integrated across the South. Now, what about now? The 65 years later, the recognition of these individuals of 1955, the 85, Scarborough 85, as Martin likes to call them, that accomplishment is worthy of all the recognition we can give them. It's so important, and I appreciate so much what Rose Weaver, John Spradlin, and Martin McBride have done in leading the committee to bring us to where we are today. It's an amazing accomplishment, and you need to understand the significance of what these people did when they were your age. Absolutely, very much appropriate. Now, it has been too long in coming, as Martin said earlier. I was glad to see the Clinton 12 recognized a few years ago. That, too, was too long in coming. However, the public schools has been as elaborated on in the National Center for Educational Statistics on public and private schools. That issue of whether Oak Ridge is a public school or not is one that's been a stumbling block for us. And we've overcome that now. We now have the proof that in fact, it was considered a public school. So it can be stated that Oak Ridge was the first public school in the South to be integrated and be accurate in that statement. So there's no need for any hesitation now to claim Oak Ridge was the first public school. Notice the defining distinction between public and private schools is the different sources of support. Public schools depend primarily on local, state, here's the key, and federal government funds. The Atomic Agency Energy was a federal fund at the time, a government agency, and it was providing the funds for Oak Ridge schools. Thank you so much for letting me give you this brief history of integration in Oak Ridge. Thank you. I'm going to put this down there.
Take a look at that handsome man right there. Our next speaker today is Mr. L.C. Gibson. L.C. was a Wildcat. He graduated in 1959. That's his senior picture out of the 1959 yearbook. After graduating from Oak Ridge High School, he went to work as a technician at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He was working on several teams, doing research on nude mice and then on coal fuel as part of the oil crisis. For 20 years, he served as a technician out at ORNL and then became the head of procurement at the lab as well. Mr. L.C. Gibson is a member of the Scarborough 85, and he is elected to speak to you guys today to share some of his experiences around what it was like to integrate Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High School at that time. Please give a warm round of applause to Mr. L.C. Gibson.
Good morning, everyone. As Ray said, my name is L.C. Gibson or Larry Gibson. And the reason I use both is depending on my work career at the school system, from Scarborough School in the 3rd grade through the 12th grade at Oak Ridge High School here in 1959, and my 35 years work career at the National Lab. All my records publication is under L.C. Gibson. But after that, in my community service projects, volunteer work, anything I've done in the community, served on the board of the director of the Boys Club for over 20 years, is under Larry Gibson. When Mr. John Spatling asked me to be a part of his program 7 weeks back, at first I told him no, that I did not want to be a part of it. I told him my experience at the high school in my 4 years was different than most of my other classmates. But Mr. Spatling said that my story needed to be told. So if you guys will bear with me for a few moments, I will try to give you my perspective on my time at Oak Ridge High School from 1955 to 1959. And bear, I guess you guys know what it is, tolerate me, put up with me for a few moments. That's an old saying, I guess. I was born in 1940 in Lexington, Mississippi. And I moved to Oak Ridge in 1949. As Ray said earlier there, that was when the city of Oak Ridge, not the city, that's when MSI opened up the cities and removed the guard gates so anyone could come in. My uncle, who I lived with from the time I came to Oak Ridge in 1949, was already working for MSI. So he came to Mississippi and got me and brought me to Oak Ridge because Oak Ridge had better schools, although they was not up to standards as they should have been, but they was better than what I was going to in Lexington, Mississippi. In Lexington, Mississippi, we had a one-room, church building. It was a church and a school. Pot-belly stove, like you saw in the picture up here, that was used for heat, and one teacher for all the students that attended the one-room school. So when I came to Scarborough started Scarborough School in 1949 in the 3rd grade. It was a big, great improvement over what I was used to in Lexington, Mississippi. Scarborough School, we had some of the best teachers that the state could employ, but they did not have all the resources that they needed to do an effective job. A lot of our books was hand-me-downs, some of the pages was missing, and other things I go into that, good teachers, but they was not supplied with their equipment and stuff that other schools had. Like I said, I started school in the 3rd grade in 1949, and Scarborough School was, like I said, from grade 1 through 12th grade. While I was in, let me go back and get this part. While I was in Lexington, Mississippi, before I came to Oak Ridge in 49, my grandmother owned her own farm. We did not share a crop or what have you. They had their own farm. So whenever my parents would have to go into Lexington, Mississippi town to get supplies, my parents would always have a survival talk with me. And the survival talk was, get off the sidewalk when you encounter a white person. Do not look the white person in his eyes. Today, black parents and myself, I got great grandkids, we're having to have that same talk with our sons, how to survive when you're stopped by the police. The Scarborough community that I grew up in was like one big family. Everybody looked out for each other. Most of the teachers, my teachers, at least 4 of them, lived in the Scarborough community. Mr. Marie Anthony, Bertie and Bill Scott, and Miss Fleming. Matter of fact, they lived about 4 or 5 houses down the street from me. So we had teachers during that time period that lived in the Scarborough community, and everybody looked out and cared for each other. Black families was not able to move to any other parts of the city of Oak Ridge until the mid-60s. All blacks lived in Scarborough. As Ray alluded to there, we could not eat at the restaurants, could not go to all the local places or eating places, had black and white restrooms. On August 28, 1955, a young 14-year-old black man named Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi for talking to a white woman. It was such a gruesome murder that it made national news, newspapers. In that time period, we did not have the CNN and all the cable networks that you have now, where you can get news from anything that happened, whenever it happened. But in '55, that was all over the newspaper and the TV because it was a bad, real bad thing that should never have happened. And about 9 days later, after that bad news, I started school at Oak Ridge High School. I was a 14-year-old freshman. One of the first things I had to adjust to when I started school, I was a freshman here in 1955, was having to adjust to being around approximately 1,700 students. And most of them did not want me or my classmate in their school. Most of them would ignore us. It was like sometime you were still at Scarborough, blacks off in one area, whites, most whites in the other area, what have you. But like I said, none of these students that I had had any contact with before I started school here, so it was all new friends that you're trying to make. And the downside to that was if you made friends, and I made a lot of friends during my 4 years, you was not able to go to their home to interface with them, to study with them, to compare class notes, or what have you. So, and then you could go out, in my 4 years at the school, Oak Ridge High School, I would say I probably had no more than 3 or 4 classes where I had another black person in my class. Like I said, the plus side there, like I said, you could compare notes and study together and what have you. But other than gym class, when you had gym, sometimes be more than seven in gym class, but first year algebra, home study, social study, whatever, you know, it was very rare because it was only about 40 of our students that integrated. So we talk about maybe about 10 in each class, freshman through the 12th grade. And everybody may be taking algebra, you're taking from a different teacher, you may take it at a different time, and what have you. And I had some very good, I cannot remember, sometimes I have a problem remembering my own name, but I recall some very good teachers I had. I remember Miss Davis, as I recall, she was my algebra teacher and geometry teacher. It was very nice and very, really helped me with that concept of algebra and geometry. I love math, but have not had it at Scarborough up to the 8th grade. You know, you're starting something new. Miss Ledgerwood, as I recall, I can't recall if she was my English teacher or my the social studies teacher, but she was quite a nice lady. And then also I took a mechanical drawing from Mr. Gene Moody, who was also the baseball coach, I think, at that time. So my defense to cope with the uncomfortable situation that I was been placed in at Oak Ridge High School was to do my best in each class that I took at the school for my 4 years. I chose not to participate in any activities, clubs, extra activities where it may have been after school activity at the high school. I chose not to do that. It was my choice. I rode bus number 18 from the Scarborough community to Oak Ridge High School each morning, and the same bus 18 in the afternoon when the school was over, back to my old black community. Still, we could not live any place else but in Scarborough. And Scarborough, like I said, was one big family, everybody, good family. Mr. Fred Brown was the only black teacher at Oak Ridge High School in my 4 years, from 55 through 59. Only one black teacher. There was 4 of my black classmates that graduated with me in 1955, 1959, out of a student graduating class of 349. In 1963, I started working at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the Biology Division under Dr. Pete Wahlberg in the Notobiotic Research Facility. Notobiotic is germ-free glove box. We did everything through gloves and working in plastic boxes, glove boxes. I did that for about approximately 10 years. And then from 1973 to 1984, I worked for Dr. Mike Holliner in the cold research program. We did research on trying to find an oil substitute for the oil crisis that the United States and the world was in the early 1970s. Very interesting work that we did. And from 1984 to 1998, I was the director of the Procurement Purchasing Department of the Biology Division. I retired from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 1998 after 35 years of service. I was 58 years old when I retired. And the reason I retired was at that time, the average survival age for someone working until their retirement year, I think around 17 months. And I had told my wife, our kids, I did not want to be that number. And I had one of the best jobs in the biology division. My boss tried to get me more money to stay. But I said, my house is paid for. My kids are out of college. I'm going home. And I have not regretted it in 22 years. Thank you. I have a little problem with equilibrium. That's why I'm walking so tenderly.
Elsie, you can walk any way you want to walk while you're here at Oak Ridge High School. Let's give him another hand. Just another example of an American hero and a member of the Scarborough 85. Our next speaker we have is someone you all know very well, our very own Coach Graham. Coach Graham is the nephew of Lawrence Graham, who is also a member of the Scarborough 85. And he's had some conversation with Lawrence, who wasn't able to make it here today over some health concerns and maybe a little bit of shyness. But Coach Graham is going to share some of the stories that they've talked about this week and that he wanted to have shared with you. So please welcome up Coach Graham.
First of all the seniors, just stand up for 1 second. Stand up for 1 second. All right, now sit down, sit down. I know these days attention spans are short, very short. So just try something a little different, stand up for a second. I just want to thank these beautiful women, Mr. Gibson, handsome young man there. This is my village. This was the village that raised John and Coach Spratlin, I'm sorry. But that's who raised us. I don't know if you know, but in the Scarborough community, some people call it Gamble Valley. Most of you know it as the Valley. Our streets are named after historically black colleges. And the reason that was because when they started school and they integrated school, they wanted to know where the students were coming from. That way, as Mr. Gibson spoke about, you could tell how many colored students you had in your class by their street address. So, food for thought. I just want to thank you all for your commitment and for your sacrifice for me. I went to Oak Ridge High School myself, and through what and I know it was tough, but through what you were able to withstand and complete, it gave me an opportunity to go to one of the best schools in the United States. So thank you. I'm speaking on the behalf of my uncle, Dr. Ahmed Alamisi, who regretfully could not make it due to, if y'all know him, his pride and of health. He's real big on health, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But with his age, 80 years old, the travel from Charlotte, North Carolina, and the COVID, he just felt like, not just for him, but from others, he didn't want to put at risk and to be at risk. But he does really appreciate the effort to acknowledge this moment in time. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about my uncle. He named me, a lot of you only know me as Coach Graham. A few of you done snuck and found my real name, but he named me, my siblings, and my cousins. My uncle rode a bike. When he lived in Detroit, he rode a bike to work. He didn't believe that driving a car was a necessity. He rode a bike to work, and even at 80 years old in Charlotte, North Carolina, he still rides his bike around more so than he uses his car. He was invited to the Olympic trials, Oak Ridger. He was recruited by the Cincinnati Reds while he was in high school, and later St. Louis Cardinals forms team right after high school, but he decided to focus on education. And if you know my uncle, you know why. One thing that I know, that I heard is kind of legendary about him, was he jumped out of the pits. Anybody run track? If you run track or participate in track, raise your hand. Raise it high, don't be shy, y'all got a pretty good track team. All right, well, if you ever seen a long jump pit, he jumped out of the pit. So guess what? You couldn't record his jump. He was a catcher. And anybody play baseball? I got any baseball players in here? I know I have those. Okay. He was a catcher at Oak Ridge High School. What he was known for was that whenever they got a hit, the opposing team, he would run, or what they call trail the batter, to first base to back up a missed throw on first base. Many times he outran the batter. He was on the basketball team. He was the valedictorian of his university. He was a U.S. veteran. He's a state of Tennessee noted author and writer. He is credited through those writings of inspiring young writers of color, poets in the 60s and 70s. And just like the Rolling Stones looked up to the blues singer, the Howlin' Wolf, which y'all look that up, that's one of my favorites, he's one of my favorites. And the Beatles with Chuck Berry, although their music was toward a certain population, it didn't matter what color you are, you learned to accept it, and that's the way my uncle was with his writings. Because his writings were all about telling your truth. He has received numerous awards. He spoke throughout the United States and even abroad. He was a professor at a major university. But you never hear him talk about him being a professor. He only talks about being a teacher at in the inner city schools of Detroit. He's a very modest and humble person. Everything I just told you about him, he never told me. He never talked about. Matter of fact, Olympic trials, my cousin, his daughter, Ejaniah, she went to the Olympic trials. She never knew that he was invited. She didn't know that till about 10 to 15 years ago. Coach Moody had a lot to do with informing me as a young kid. Coach Moody, I think, was his last years here when I first got in high school, and he realized my last name. And he just asked me who's my family, and I told him who my father was, which my father was a prominent athlete here, which he talked about my father, he talked about my uncle. So through the years, you know, my father keeps in touch with him, and he was able to tell me a lot of these things. The other things I just researched and looked up because my uncle doesn't talk about these things. This was hard. This was hard because Coach Spratlin, Miss Weaver, they told me to get in touch with my uncle, talk to him, get him to come down here, this and that. And I knew him. I told them that wasn't going to happen. But I seen the initiative that they were pushing, and I felt it was my place to at least try. Now, in my family, my uncle does pretty much stay away or stay to himself. But fortunately, for some reason, my grandmother always said that we were very similar, and we had a lot of the same characteristics. But for some reason, I'm able to reach him. So my aunt and my uncle, Rufus, told me that if y'all want to get anything out of Ahmed for have Kwayu, Coach Graham, you all, have him to speak to him. So for the last month, 2 weeks, even last night, I tried my best to pry things from him. So when I asked him, I came up with this idea of going with 5 questions because it's for you, the students. And he was a college professor, teacher, so I know that he loved students, loved young adults. And I asked him, you know, Uncle, question number 1. There was a long pause. then how was your day? And he goes on and talk about my kids and my father, and we laughed about my grandmother and stories. So I tried to get back on topic and ask him again. And he said, you know, you never can tell what the weather's going to be day by day nowadays. I can remember when winter was winter and fall was fall. But I was able to get him going. And I knew a way to get him to speak and to talk, because he's a very educated man. He said, yeah, I was receiving all that, the mail and stuff. People had called me, and they got in touch with me about everything that's going on. He said, Kwayu, I know what they're doing, and I appreciate what they're doing. He said, but when they tried to reach me, they tried to contact me. They tried to contact me as Lawrence Edward Graham, Jr. He said, that's not my name. So if I was to call you Jesse, will you turn around? I said, no, that's not my name. He said, exactly. He said, and that's no, I'm not trying to put anyone down, and that's not a mark at them. But you have to understand what your name, and this is what he wants, this, through talking to him, this is what I think his message would be for you. And it's cross-generational. It's all about your name, Kwayu. Your name is everything. He said, it's how you identify with yourself. Your name is your identity. Then we went on and talked about that, and we went on about that, and that was one day. Next time I was able to talk to him, I somehow got him again. It took me about an hour, but we talked about mindset. And he said, when the decision was made, we talked about when he came here and his mindset of coming from a school of color, a black school, to integrating. And he's talked about, it was all a mindset. He said that he did not want to go to Oak Ridge schools with a slave mentality. He said that was his mindset. He said he didn't have any anger. He didn't have any fear. He said the reason why is because the same expectations he had for himself at Scarborough School, he was going to have for himself at Oak Ridge High School. And he said that he wanted to challenge the thought of inferiority. So he knew to do that, he had to do the right things. He had to make, as Mr. Gibson was saying, he had to make the highest marks. He had to challenge his teachers. He had to work a little. If it means for him to work harder, that's what he's going to have to do. He was on time to class. He didn't give them anything to talk negatively about it. Sometimes, although it burned in him, he had to accept what was said and accept what he went through. He said this. He went on and he was talking and he wanted me to understand this. And I've heard this from the time I was small. I've heard this, and he kind of went into why he would tell us this and why my father would tell us this. And this was no disrespect to any other student, any other black student, but sometimes you have a mindset, your mindset may be different than your other students. But he said there's two types of ways you can look at things. You can have a get-by attitude, or you can have a go-by attitude. That was something that my father would tell me when I was real young, that I heard him say, that he heard his brother say. And what he means by get-by attitude is you're willing to fit in. Each one of us are exceptional. Each one of you are exceptional. But when you fit in, it's like a puzzle piece. You're just a piece of that puzzle. If you're a square, guess what? You can't even look at the circle cut out. Only way you can get in is to go to the square. He said, now let's make that piece a star. The star can't get in the circle, the star can't get in the square, but the star can stand alone and everybody will look at it. So you can either get by or you can go by. That was several weeks ago. Now we're getting closer to the day, to last night. He told me that it wasn't all hunky-dory. He said the truth was that everybody's going to tell this story. We're going to clap and say kumbaya. He said, but that wasn't the truth. That wasn't the truth. He said it was students that did not want him here. He said it was teachers that did not want him here. He said they were both black and white. He talked about a lot of things that happened to him that imagine, 14, 15, 16 years old, you're being told that you're different than any other student. You didn't have the same expectations. You wasn't allowed the same privileges as the other students. So I'm going to go back and tell you some other things that he didn't tell me, but I heard throughout the year. I want you, every one of you, you're seniors, so you're within, 17, 16, 17, 18 years old. Imagine at your age, you love sports. He was an accomplished athlete. Imagine at your age that you had to go home after school, sit by a radio, and wait till someone decide whether or not you can get in a car, drive to your school to play in a game. My father talks about the time. My father always looked up to my uncle. He basically idolized my uncle. And my uncle went down the street in Scarborough to help someone rake some leaves. He was doing something. All of a sudden on the radio, the transistor radio, my dad said he heard Lawrence Graham Jr., please report to the school. Lawrence Graham Jr., please report to the school. That was on the radio right before the basketball game. So my dad took off running to find him, found him and told him, hey, you get to play today. He immediately had to stop what he was doing, go get his stuff, and head over to the school to play a basketball game. He said a lot of his teammates were very supportive of him, and he really appreciated that. Because I asked him about that situation, and he said, yeah, those things happen numerous times. Imagine competing. I see football players, I know Friday's big game, and tonight's a big game, and imagine, swag, imagine. You score a touchdown, but it don't count because you're unattached. What unattached means that although I play for that school, although I compete for that school, although I may win my event for that school, I'm not part of that school. I'm an unattached athlete. I told you about him jumping out of a pit and would probably still have the long jump record at Oak Ridge High School, but he wasn't he wasn't an athlete at the school. He wore the same uniform. He practiced with them. He was considered on their team. Matter of fact, I even think he took the team picture. But he was an unattached athlete. For him, at 15 and 16 years old, that was traumatic, as I'm sure it would be for you. But now we're about a week away. There was courage. He said during this time, a lot of people showed a lot of courage. A lot of people gave a chance. You know, we talked about change being hard because it disrupts comfort. Change is always hard because it disrupts comfort. Being part of the status quo, once again, fitting in. But the black students and some white students worked together to make this idea work. Now just imagine if it didn't. There would be 21 students that would be lost. What you mean 21, coach? Your math wrong. No. There was a Clinton 12, and there was a Little Rock 9. Imagine that. where would we be? What he wants to leave with you is always keep your mental character. We got a lot of things going on in this country today, in this world today. There's a lot of people that influence how we think. You are an individual, and you have to keep your mental character. All of us, a child, a baby knows right from wrong. Keep your mental character. Him and I talked about you guys being a reporter of truth. I'm talking about truth with the TH at the end. Things can be true, but not the whole story. Truth gives the whole story with the TH in the end. Be willing to be reporters of the truth. Because all of us believe, and I hope I don't mess it up for some of y'all, but if I do, I support it. I do apologize. kkgraham@ortn.edu if your parents have a problem with this. But all of us believed in the Easter Bunny. At that time, no one could tell us that it wasn't the truth. I shouldn't even mention it, but even Santa Claus. But as we got older, we learned to find ways to find out the truth. For me, it was seeing my daddy put a quarter under my pillow when he removed my tooth from under that pillow. Because I wanted to see a bunny that big that can come in my house and put something under my pillow. You all have to be the reporters of the truth. You find out about this what we're celebrating now. Research it. Question it. Be your own dictionary. This is another thing that we heard growing up in our house, was to be your own dictionary. That means you describe who you are. You describe who you are. Be your own dictionary. Don't let others define you. And last, raise your hand if you're a cheerleader. We don't have any senior cheerleaders? Okay, I'm going to pretend that we have some senior cheerleaders. When y'all don't they call that a pyramid, that when everybody stack up on each other? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, I'm getting nods. All right. Y'all got the mask on, can't really, All right. When you cheerleaders, when you form that pyramid, two things can happen. You can divide, meaning one of the bases go this way and one of the bases go that way. And guess what happens? They fall. Or you can stand united. My uncle, last thing that he wants you all to understand, it is up to you to, no matter what you hear, no matter where you push, no matter what you go through, that you all believe in yourself, trust yourself, and always stand united. Once again, thank you for the opportunity for me to come up here and speak on the behalf of my uncle, Dr. Ahmed Alamisi. Thank you.
I think you can all see why Coach Kwayu Graham is one of the most sought-after public speakers in the Southeast. He's intelligent, he's articulate, he's an amazing man. Let's give another round of applause for Coach Graham. If you go on to Wikipedia and you research or you Google search Oak Ridge High School integration, you'll find out that this was the first school in the South to integrate. And you'll read a false narrative about what that experience was like for the people who endured it. It'll say that it was relatively drama-free. We didn't have the National Guard called out. We didn't have dogs in the streets. We didn't have people being shot with water hoses. We didn't have bomb threats and school evacuations. But the idea that this was a relatively well-planned, peaceful transition belittles the experiences of those who endured the change. And it's important for us as Americans and as members of this community to understand that there's not one single experience related to the integration of Oak Ridge High School or Robertsville Junior High School. There's 85. And all 85 are different, important, and powerful. And I would ask that you all please give another round of applause to our Scarborough 85 who are here today. Yes, stand up, please. Coach Graham was talking earlier about a village, and this is an incredible village to have been a part of. Just so that you guys will know, we have set up in the media center all day today a camera and a recording equipment so that if you are so moved and you would be interested in recording, this is for staff, for students, anybody in the building, you can go into the media center and you can record a message of thanks to the Scarborough 85. And we're going to try to have that together for them at the football game tonight and in part of the celebration that we're doing on Sunday. We have purchased plaques to honor the Scarborough 85 for the very first integration of a public school in the South. Those plaques are going to be hung up next week and on display. We'll be officially unveiling them this Sunday evening on the 65th anniversary, September 6th, of the integration of our schools. This concludes our presentation this morning. I do want to say this. We had solicited a lot of questions from students, and we got hundreds of questions from students about what your experience was like, and unfortunately we didn't get to that place today. But this is not a celebration that is a one-and-done celebration. This is something that we are going to be continuing throughout the year. An anniversary is just that. It's a celebration of an anniversary, and it's a year-long experience. So perhaps with working with Rose and with Martin, we can set up another opportunity to bring in some more folks to answer some of those student questions, because these questions that these students wrote are amazing, and I think I think they will be very interested in hearing your experiences on that. So at this time, students, thank you for your time and your attention today. You're now dismissed to go to your second period class, and thank you guys all once again.